Okay everyone, I'm gonna need a few more ideas on what we should name our console. So far we got Super Duper Nintendo. We've also got the Playbox Cast. We've got Virtual Boy 2, this one's good, we swear. We've got The Game Man. And then of course, we've got Nintendo 90210 Cleveland Browns 3. Does anyone have any other ideas, or do they have a favorite? Anything we could go forward with? Why not something simple and just name it Nintendo 64 since it has 64 bits? That's not terrible, but I think we can do better. Well then how about we just name it off of its shape? I mean, that's bound to sell well. I like it. Everyone, may I introduce you to the Nintendo Oblong Rounded Edges Rectangular Prism. On second thought, Nintendo 64 works. What is your favorite video game console of all time? Is it an amazing piece of technology filled to the brim with incredible games, or are you a Sega fan? Video game consoles have come a long way since their beginning, and although there have been a few hiccups along the way, consoles are usually an improvement on their predecessors. Most companies do very well by keeping the core of their consoles the same, but making improvements so the overall experience is superior. I'm mostly talking about PlayStation and Xbox here. All of their consoles are incredibly similar and don't change their formula too much. Obviously they're not completely identical, but for the most part they don't change too much for good reasons. They found a formula that works, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The one company that continuously does change their consoles is obviously Nintendo. They have certain small similarities, but they still have massive differences which Sony and Microsoft never even dare to try. To make your controller go from this to straight perfection to this crap, that's something so dumb Sony would never try when they can just re-release the same console with improved graphics for $600 and everyone will still buy it. Nintendo has a trend of making a console, then making an improved version before moving on to a brand new idea. Just look at the NES to Super Nintendo, and Wii to Wii U, even though that flopped like hell, but the Wii U by itself was objectively better. Please excuse me, I need to go wash my mouth out after saying such bullshit. And in between all those consoles were the first consoles Nintendo used to reach into the 3D world. I already made a video on the improved version, the GameCube, earlier this year, so let's check out arguably Nintendo's most revolutionary console. The one that paved the way for 3D and multiplayer gameplay for years and gave me countless hours of fun as a child. I unfortunately don't have my original console, but luckily I do have the second console that my brother and I got as a limited edition bundle with Hey You Pikachu. The game is fucking trash, but the console is amazing. Today, we are taking a look at the Nintendo 64. The Nintendo 64 was released in June of 1996 with releases in North America and Europe later that year and early 1997 respectively. Gaming was beginning to make the transition to 3D during the 90s, and Nintendo wanted to step their foot into that gold mine. We saw a little bit of attempted 3D late in the Super Nintendo with the Super FX chip, which even that blew people's minds. Holy shit, they're shapes! Nintendo wanted to make their next console fully 3D and created a new system under the codename Project Reality. In 1994, Nintendo announced the unofficial name of Ultra 64 based on the fact it was a 64-bit console. It was supposed to finally be named the Ultra Famicom in Japan, which would fit the naming style they had over there, but then they said fuck it, numbers. The Nintendo 64 was then finally officially announced in November 1995 before being released the next year. With the release, the console only had 2 launch titles, which may make it seem like the launch was a bit of a rocky start, but it had one of the most revolutionary games of all time. And also Mario 64, what more could you ask for? These two games were perfect to show off how much grander and powerful the Nintendo 64 was compared to the Super Nintendo. Pilotwings was one of those fake 3D games that looked very impressive, but actually making the game fully 3D was what the series needed. Literally all you were doing is flying around. I mean, there's not much you can do without 3D. And as a launch title for Nintendo's first 3D console, this was a perfect demo to show what 3D would look like for every game coming in the future. And then Mario 64. Do I really need to say anything? It's fucking Mario 64, who hasn't played it? It took Mario from this to this. Is it bad I actually think Mario World looks better? Ugly, blocky characters aside, Mario 64 is one of, if not the most revolutionary game of all time. It took a linear level-by-level game and turned it into an open-world adventure where you could do almost anything whenever you wanted and changed Mario games forever. Until Mario went back to 2D and made the same game 4 times thinking we would buy them all. They were right. Mario 64 wasn't perfect, despite what any nostalgic Nintendo 64 apologist may say, but for being the first true 3D Mario game, it was amazing and started an entire 3D platformer movement. Some even surpassed Mario with amazing adventures, but for every Banjo-Kazooie, there's a Spyro Enter the Dragonfly to even it out. Mario 64 was more than enough to push this console off shelves, and it felt like every family in the 90s had an N64. We've all seen the famous video of the kid getting one for Christmas. This console was a big deal, especially for me. The N64 was the first console my family ever owned, and I had a much different experience with it than every other Nintendo console. The NES and Super Nintendo, I just played those at my neighbor's house growing up. I watched the Switch presentation and immediately ordered the system. I have terrible Joy-Con drift now. I wonder if those are connected. In 2012, I bought the Wii U on release date, and yes, I now have an arrest warrant. The Wii was so hyped up, and my brother and I got one for Christmas so we could virtually beat the shit out of each other. The GameCube came out when I was young, but I remember getting it and being shocked how much better the games looked. But the N64? I just popped out of the womb and was basically handed a controller. I saw it as the console because it was always there and just assumed it was what everyone played. I was shocked to learn that there were other consoles to play, and you should have seen my reaction when I learned about the PlayStation. I've never played you, but I hate you because you're not Nintendo. I was so open-minded. The biggest issue many failed consoles have is a lack of games, but my god, the Nintendo 64 has such a good library of games. Literally every major Nintendo franchise got a new game to show off how the games could function in 3D, except Metroid. I guess I don't know the definition of literally. Games like Star Fox really took advantage of 3D, making an already amazing game even more amazing. I mean, the original was basically Galaga at a zoo, but with the camera behind the spaceship, while Star Fox 64 made the game so much more in-depth, even if it really is just a 3D copy of the original. This was the first step for all the 3D adventures Star Fox has given us, like Assault, the game for horny furries, and Then there's even games like Kirby 64 where 3D was literally slapped on with no reason other than to say this game could only be on the N64. The game is amazing, don't get me wrong, but there was literally no reason for this game to have 3D. It would work exactly the same if it was purely in 2D, but they realized they needed to make the 64 and the name fit and went, look, we added curves! Then another big genre that took advantage of 3D were racing games like Mario Kart 64 and Wave Race 64. Are you seeing a trend with the names? Mario Kart 64 was the first game that I played with friends, and after about 3 races, the last I played with them. This game was amazing for the time with solid graphics, great courses, and finally controls with a control stick. I absolutely despise any racing or 3D game with a D-pad, and this gave us so much more control over every movement. In the 90s, this felt like a dream and was perfect, but after playing the new Mario Karts, I have no idea how I thought this controller was good. I need to preface what I'm going to say by saying that I love the Nintendo 64, remember that, but I just have to say this. The Nintendo 64 controller is fucking dog shit. Who the hell designed this thing? Who is it made for? I don't know about you, but I only have 2 hands, so what the fuck am I supposed to do with 3 prongs? As a kid, I legitimately had no idea how to hold this thing and probably switched my hands around a few times every time I played a game. I understand this was their first 3D console and we're making a big change from the NES and Super Nintendo controllers, but PlayStation's first was great. They still use the same damn design to this day, while we haven't seen anything close to the N64 controller since because it's awful. I will admit, the parts of the controller you actually are supposed to hold feel comfortable enough, and the buttons are in good positions to use. But how can anybody possibly use the D-pad or L button without breaking their hand? I'm literally getting cramps just trying to do it for this video. It's not feasible. Luckily, most games don't use either of those buttons, but then why does the controller even have those buttons to begin with? Just cut off the left prong and boom, the controller makes sense. I mean, then it would kind of just look like if the GameCube controller had a stroke, but at least it's better than this 3-dicked monstrosity. Even though this controller was god-awful, the control stick still allowed for such better control and movement in some of the most influential games ever. And how can we talk about the Nintendo 64 without mentioning one of the greatest games of all time? Pokemon Snap. Using a control stick to move the camera in all directions with precision to take pictures of Pokemon wouldn't have been possible with any other console, and the N64 did it perfectly. It's really not worth going back to these days, especially since we're getting a new Pokemon Snap soon, but for the time it was incredible. Oh yeah, and then there's games that were alright like Ocarina of Time. Joking aside, this was and will forever be one of the greatest games ever made and influenced gaming forever. A story unlike anything we had ever seen that was so incredible the developers used it to split the entire Zelda timeline. And even if that timeline is a heaping pile of bullshit, it still shows how important Ocarina of Time is to the series. The graphics and controls are definitely dated, but for the time it was better than anything the world had ever seen. A true modern remake with graphics on par with Breath of the Wild could honestly be arguably the greatest game ever, but we only ask for Skyward Sword remakes on this channel, so ignore that idea. Ocarina of Time was so successful the developers needed to make a remake, so they copied all the assets, turned the brightness down, looked at the most random character in the game and said, I got it! Majora's Mask is such an amazing sequel, even though the stories really don't connect at all, other than Link looking for Navi at the beginning. Nearly everything in the game was improved, and you can make the argument it's superior to Ocarina of Time. And I will make that argument, Majora's Mask is better. Overall, the Nintendo 64's library of games has something for everyone. There's first-person shooters like GoldenEye 007 and Perfect Dark with amazing gameplay in single-player and multiplayer. These games are near perfect. But if you're a psychopath and want to shoot animals, there's Turok the Dinosaur Hunter, and I know I'm going to be judged for this, but I think Turok is better than GoldenEye. My game reviewer card probably just got revoked. I know I already talked about Mario 64, but it started an entire trend of 3D platformers and collectathons. I think the N64 might have the best group of collectathons and platformers with games like Conker's Bad Fur Day, Rayman 2, Donkey Kong 64, and of course the greatest platformer to ever exist, Banjo-Kazooie. They all had similar gameplay, but their own unique charm and style to differentiate themselves from each other. In fact, it feels like the N64 was the start of Nintendo really adding charm to games and focused more on developed stories. A perfect example is Paper Mario. Mario RPG did come out on the Super Nintendo and was essentially a precursor to Paper Mario, but this game took the ideas from Mario RPG and turned it up tenfold. The characters have so much more personality and development than any Mario game before, and the turn-based battling was so smooth with a great level up system. This truly was one of the best games Nintendo has ever released and launched one of my personal favorite franchises, and then they ruined it. Fuck you, Nintendo. I love the Nintendo 64. It gave me so many hours of fun as a kid, and it pains me to say even a single bad thing about it, but luckily it has near no flaws. Except the fucking controller. This thing is trash. The Nintendo 64 wasn't the most powerful, nor did it have the biggest library, and it didn't have the best controller. Where was I going with this? The N64 was without a doubt Nintendo's most revolutionary console. It brought almost every major franchise into the 3D world with amazing games and even started some fan favorite series. Sure, some went downhill after the system and others just don't even exist anymore, but the N64 games will always be there. The Nintendo 64 isn't perfect, but Nintendo did amazing for their first 3D console and it's become one of the most iconic systems ever. I will always tip my hat to Nintendo because for their first 3D console, this was damn near perfect. Nintendo never fails with their first attempt. Well, shit.